Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. We would now like to move on to the first session for today, making sense of the tremors in the transatlantic security architecture and India's Europe outreach. Our moderator for this session is Mr. Vineet Malhotra. Mr. Malhotra is a senior journalist with over 2 decades of experience in the mainstream media. Mr. Malhotra started out with sports, hosting the first season of the IPL, the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics and the ICC World Cup, 2011, 2015 and 2019. He later joined Times Now, Z News and Tiranga TV as the executive editor and the primetime debate host show. Currently, he's a senior consulting editor and primetime debate show host for NewsX. Just for ladies and gentlemen, but in a good way. We will be having a tea break right now, as Mr. Malhotra will be back after a couple of minutes for this particular session. So, we would now like to move on to the first session for today, making sense of the tremors in the transatlantic security architecture and India's Europe outreach. Our moderator for this session is Mr. Vineet Malhotra, who is just about to enter the conference hall, and he's just about to enter from the second door, and here he is. Mr. Vineet Malhotra is a senior journalist with over 2 decades of experience in the mainstream media. He started out with sports, hosting the first session of the IPL, the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, and the ICC World Cup 2011, 2015, and 2019. He later joined Times Now, Z News, and the Tiranga TV as executive editor and primetime debate show host. Currently, he's a senior consulting editor and primetime debate show host for NewsX. Our session moderator is requested to formally introduce our panelists, Mr. Alexandros Dimitrakopoulos, Mr. Leonid Newsisyan, and Mr. Abhijeet Iyer Mitra. Panelists are requested to please come up on stage for the introductions. Thank you.
Right, thank you everyone for Alexandros Dimitrakopoulos. Alexander is the Director of Strategic and Operational Planning and Center for Foreign Policy Planning, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Greece. He has over 20 years of experience as a diplomat. He has also served as Office of Secretary General, Policy Planning Unit Defense, Policy and Planning Directorate in NATO for over 5 years. Alexandros, thank you for being here, and please a round of applause for him. I'm going to sit here so I can see him. Okay, next is Leonid Newsisyan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Leonid is a defense analyst and research fellow at APRI Armenia. His research interests range from Russia and CIS countries, armed forces to defense industry and arms control. He has a lot of experience in consulting, conducting research, including OSINT, and managing groups of researchers. Leonid is regularly quoted on issues related to Russian and international military technology and industry by foreign publications and analytical centers such as the Center for Strategic and International Studies USA, the Jamestown Foundation USA, the Washington Post, the AI Monitor, the Russia Matters, the Center for Land Warfare Studies in India, the Observer Research Foundation, MacDonald Laurier Institute, Canada. A round of applause for him, please. Abhijeet Iyer Mitra, last but not the least. Abhijeet is a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, a defense economist. He appears regularly in print and on TV. He is the author of 2 books and is doing his PhD at King's College London. He has regular columns in News 18, First Post, The Print, Economic Times, Business Standard, Mint and Money Control, as well as bylines in all major national dailies. He also has co-authored 2 books and has several academic publications to his credit dealing with defense and foreign policy. Prior to his current post, he coordinated the National Security Program at the Observer Research Foundation. He He has also been a visiting scholar at Sandhya National Laboratories, Albuquerque, and the Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. And last but not least, we also follow each other on Twitter. Big round of applause for him, please. Okay, so the topic that we are going to be discussing today is making sense of the tremors in the transatlantic security architecture and India's European outreach. Abhijeet, I'll begin with you. Well, how would you define, India's European outreach? For the most part of recent memory and most part of historical memory as well, India and Europe have been connected through an umbilical cord, but it has been an invisible umbilical cord. There has been dependency, and there's also been a lack of non-recognition to issues pertaining in India by Europe. I would also like to quote our countdown to say, and it has become sort of a folklore speech as well, when he said that Europe considers that its problems are the world's problems, and the world's problems are not Europe's problems. In context to what's happening today, how would you categorize this complex yet palpable relationship?
So I break this up into three categories. The first is the fact that India wasn't what it was, say, 30, 40 years back. We've got a lot more muscle. We're much richer. We've got a much more educated population. We've got a much more expressive population. And a lot of the sort of churlishness and defensiveness that used to plague us because of all our multiple inferiority complexes through the 60s, 70s, 80s aren't there anymore. It's a much more confident country. Now, the thing about confidence is you tend to be less churlish. I think you'll find that generally we don't put out pointless statements just for third world solidarity and whatnot. There used to be certain ministers a few decades back, who used to have severe foot and mouth disease, which doesn't happen anymore. It's much more controlled in that sense, I guess. But with Europe specifically, what has happened is there's been a bifurcation of our relations. The more the EU gets consolidated in this process dependency behemoth that is the EU, we find that it's much easier talking to individual countries, and we don't really like the sort of herd behavior that the EU comes with. So, there are things which the EU has to grandstand on, the death penalty being one of them, for example. Every 2 years, the EU will come and read out a little statement condemning the death penalty in usage in India. And what will happen is, in private, the French and the Germans and everyone will tell us, yeah, you do you. In public, the EU has to, it is mandated to make its protest about it. So they will always, the EU embassy here in Delhi, not Udaipur, obviously, will find the softest speaking guy with the mildest, most mousy voice to come to South Block. He will sit down there with one of the lowest ranking members of the foreign ministry and read out in a very slow, the EU generally likes to think of the death penalty as violative of human rights, and pro forma done, and then out. With the French, with the Germans, with the Poles, we have fantastic relations. In fact, the Poles in private were the most supportive, surprise, of our stance on Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. We faced the least resistance from the Poles, surprisingly. The Germans and French a bit more. Even in Germany, there used to be a kind of a German-Dutch compact in a sense, based on all these foreign service and naval officers, especially who had worked with Pakistan through the Cold War, who tended to have a very Pakistani kind of a point of view, generally Pakistan good, India bad kind of view. That's also changed. With the French, we've always had fantastic relations. We can get away with anything with the French. You want to tinker with your Mirage 2000s to drop a few nuclear bombs? Yeah, sure, go ahead, no problem. You want to do the same thing with the Rafale? Yeah, sure, go ahead, no problem at all. Just don't talk about it.
Except getting visas on time.
Except getting visas on time. And that is why nobody becomes friends with the EU ambassador here, because, he used to keep making this joke that, everybody, when in his first, every EU ambassador, everybody wants to be friends with him for the first 2 weeks. And then when they find out he has no visa pass, they're like, yeah, dude, we don't want to follow you to us.
Unfriend him.
Yeah, so that's an issue. But the second thing is also, what Donald Rumsfeld said, there's an old Europe and a new Europe. What we find is that it's much easier for us, we make that difference in, say, pragmatic Europe and doctrinaire Europe. And we find it a lot easier dealing with pragmatic Europe that doesn't pressurize us, that understand there is such a thing called isometric mimicry, where Europe's reality is not India's reality, Europe's social situation isn't India's social situation. Things have to be finessed and fine-tuned. And that is why India generally will always prefer a sort of individual bilateral approach than a collective approach. Simple example, even with sanctions on Russia. We spoke to so many European officials who were literally, first, I think it was the Swedes that came up with the categorization. What do you want to do to Russia? Do you want to de-escalate the situation? Do you want to punish Russia? Or do you want to humiliate Russia? And, the Eastern, the Baltics would be humiliate them, rub their nose in the mud. But with India, they're perfectly fine. The problem is dealing with them in a group. So it's always been that way. I think it's going to be that way, and it suits us perfectly.
All right, well said. Alexandros, geoeconomics is the use of geopolitics to, have trade relationships with a particular country. Do you think, barring India, which has an evolved policy very recently, which has been extremely appreciated by the world over, including the European Union, more or less, EU has been closed to appreciating the changing architecture of Eastern as well as Western Europe and transatlantic realities today?
I'm sorry, did you say that Europe is closed?
Yes.
To discuss?
Yes.
I'm not sure I can agree with that.
If not closed, then maybe a little stuck up, for the lack of a better word.
With the enlargement?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. You said before that the European ambassador came with a very low voice, and as I happen to know the EU ambassador to Delhi, he's a very good friend of mine because he was a policy planner like myself, and he gathered us in Brussels. His job is not easy, and his job is not easy because he has to herd cats as well, and these are us. But he also needs to take into account the complexities of the decision-making process within the EU and the construct of the EU, meaning that it has to uphold a series of principles and abide by everything that, for example, the European Parliament also stands for. Therefore, yes, I know that it may appear as the lowest common denominator sometimes and an automatic machine sometimes and everything, but I assure you that behind closed doors, with him, us, the individual nations, be it in Delhi or in Washington, we convey messages that are much stronger than that soft voice, very much done also for public diplomacy reasons, but they are very crucial as well as to state what the principles are in Europe within so many member states. The other criticism, and I know I'm not answering directly your question, but we could go there. As far as the war in Ukraine, for example, is concerned, and it is still raging, we often hear that the Europeans apply double standards, focusing on Ukraine at the expense of wars and crises in the rest of the world. Like my Prime Minister said in Delhi a few weeks ago, well, maybe there is some truth in that allegation. But there is a point to be made. Because Ukraine is much more than a local war. You've heard it all before. I'm not saying it because I'm obliged to say it, but because I've been very inspired by what has happened during the last days here in Udaipur and in my 72 hours in Delhi, where I had a crash in Indian way of thinking that I actually realized it here by discussing with all of you, and the perspective that I receive from here is so wonderful and energetic that I would like to say this, that, for example, it is a brutal challenge of international stability what is happening. Yes, we talk about the international rules-based order, and I've heard the discussions before about how this is perceived here. But this is the very order that my country, Greece, and India also have supported and have every way of interest in maintaining. The Prime Minister was not speaking only to a crowd like the one we have here. In the front rows and eventually all the way to the back, there were many of his counterparts, because they were invited by Prime Minister Modi, who is this great gatherer of personalities and of politicians around the world. He managed to do this, right? He said we all have the responsibility to use the power we have on the international stage. And no one can afford to sit on the sidelines. And we in Europe, my Prime Minister as well, in Greece, and we in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are convinced that on Ukraine, for example, India has a very important role to play, because it has a voice, an important voice, that should be heard, because it is the leading democracy of the global south. In other words, it can shape the direction of the global debate. This is how we view India, for example. India is rightly so regarded as a consensus, but it is not only your history and the history of India in the past that can prove that, but the fact that it is a voice of reason, and we've heard today so many references to morals and principles to which we also going to, in this increasingly polarized world, is very important. And we seem to forget that the real reason why the international system was created in the first place was a simple one. And yes, it is difficult to be simple, and it is difficult to have nations, large and small, recognizing that the true interest lay not in the antagonism and conflict, but in partnership and cooperation. The Hindu scriptures put so very profoundly, and we referred to it yesterday, that the world is one family. And this wisdom resonates here loud and clear, for example. But just to come back and eventually close this loop, yes, there are tremors in Europe. The tremors are the vibrations that residents of that continent feel from the tanks and the bombs that are, exploding in Europe. There are tremors eventually because we feel that the Americans are waning again. There are tremors because Russia was assertive and now became threatening, with all due respect and the condolences that we all paid due before to the victims of the terrorists, the very coward act of terrorism before that happened yesterday. But all this is increasing the strategic rivalry that has become a key feature in the world today. And what does that lead us to do as professionals, policy planners, when our leaders have a tendency to focus on emergencies? Our job is foresight. And there's a hint for you and our esteemed audience. Where has the discussion been for the last 1.5 years about where I came back from Brussels to my own country, between us policy planners in Europe? We are discussing this, finding a common way, about renewed multilateralism, based on revived global institutions. It is not that we hear you, we know that there is a need to do that. Some of us started using paternalistic references, paternalistic terms. We need to anchor. Who's going to anchor? Anchor what? You need to listen, right? And it is with the dialogue that we instigated amongst ourselves that we started to go and to bring something a little bit more than a public declaratory message. But between us, we talk again, a renewed multilateralism based on revived global institutions with common rules and objective, and that is what the dialogue is today in Europe between ourselves. And this is the dialogue that we are communicating when we engage with our partners. And to conclude just a bit, Europe also needs in this world to maximize its capacity to be heard for its own reasons, differently. But it also has to protect the interests and the security of its own people, who face the dangers of disinformation, who are facing the dangers of the extreme right, probably not being very helpful in maintaining the construct, the peaceful construct that is Europe. Yes, there may have been consequences around, that there have been consequences around the world about what Europe was doing and did throughout its own history. But for 70 years there has been peace in Europe, and there hadn't been peace in Europe before that. We want to maintain that. And the biggest challenge for the European construct is to keep on maintaining that within and also when we communicate with our new partners. Anyway, I can come back with that. I don't want to blabber.
All right, thank you for that, Alexandros. Leonid, you know, the Americans have described the India-Middle East corridor as the gateway to the future. It is also something that Armenia has welcomed. And in context to what's happening right now, with two wars going on, and India's outreach, which is, you know, pretty much appreciated by Armenia as well, how would you put these developments into context?
Thank you for the question, and I want to thank USANAS Foundation for this interesting event and this opportunity to be in this great country we all love very much. Coming back to the question, I would start from far away, let's say, because I mean, about Armenia we will also talk more in the next panel. Coming from afar, about the tremors in Europe, I would say that the Russo-Ukrainian war, which started years ago, it changed the long-standing status quo, which was already weakened. But now we see a big trend that US is becoming less present in Europe, and it's not even important who will win the elections, Biden or Trump. If Trump, it will be faster process. If Biden, it will be slower process. But we see that Europe now is moving more towards trying to have its own military capabilities, especially some countries in EU. And we also see, in parallel with what I told, the process of big organizations which were dependent on one big country. They are becoming weaker, and it's NATO, it's CSTO, it's not only Europe. So we see something new there. We see teams forming of which are based on bilateral relations, trilateral relations. For example, we have now in Europe France with Poland and Baltics, which are hardliners in terms of having stronger European military capabilities, investing more money in that domain. Or we have French-Greek strategic partnership in defense, which, by the way, interestingly, we come here to Armenia and India, because for example, Greek defense minister recently visiting Yerevan, he stated that it can be a good idea to have a multilateral format of France, Armenia, India, and Greece, as all these countries got a great development in defense cooperation and are all interconnected, and they have some mutual interests in the region. So this can be also a team. We have another team of Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Pakistan, for example, in that term. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal, and I think smaller formats are more sustainable probably in this new world order, because there is more mutual interest and more will and faster pace of making the decisions. Coming back to what you told, the question, Armenia is located between Europe and Middle East generally. It's technically part of Europe, but big events both in Europe and in Middle East affect Armenia very much, equally. This position it gives us both problems and perspectives are connecting Middle East to Europe and connecting India to Europe. Why not? So the corridor project, the South-North corridor project, which Armenia is pursuing and India is also interested in. The project which connects India via Iran, Armenia, Georgia to Europe is one of the prospects there. I think that's we should move with that. Of course, this kind of projects it's also very good if they are let's say secured by some defense cooperation on the ground, because the logistics should be stable, and I think that Armenia India cooperation there is in the defense field should be part of also this bringing the stability to the region of South Caucasus, where there we have a huge military disbalance nowadays, and of course you can have the stable logistics to Europe via that route only if there is a stability on the ground and no war actions. So thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Abhijeet, do you think that India has walked a tightrope when it comes to dealing with Europe, especially in the context of how we've been able to have a very prudent, very stable foreign policy with Russia and continue our dialogue with Europe? And also, as a supplement to this question, India has relied on European countries for its defense output. But, considering the Atmanirbharta push, considering the fact that we want to be an exporter, this relationship might go through a sea change in the next decade or so?
I would say that I see more stability in our relations both with Europe and with Russia. And our dependence on Russia is really twofold.
But the EU did criticize us for buying oil from Russia.
The EU did, but they did nothing about it. Talk is cheap, action is much more expensive. So what happens is, the first thing is, when you're an air-centric country, when you think through an Air Force prism, because most developed countries their militaries tend to be very air-centric, your vision of foreign policy or a threat is very different than when you're a ground-centric country. India has always been a very ground-centric country, very army-centric. So for us, it's still our outlook on how Asia should be hasn't changed in the last 100 years or so. I would say Modi's vision is very much the same as Nehru's vision, which is very much the same as the British vision, which is you do not allow a coming together of big geopolitical powers in Asia that can harm you in any way. So basically, I'm translating jargon, you can't allow Russia and China to ever come together. You do whatever to break them up. So what Nehru used to do was, he used to go to Khrushchev and say, oh, we love people's liberation, decolonization, hurrah, let's do this. We're going to host all these conferences, great leader, global Soviet, yay, clap, clap, clap. Then he used to go to China, to Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong and say, see, look at the Russians, they're the big power outside, but you're the real powers of Asia. We're going to host a Bandung conference for you. Zhou Enlai saw through that, which is why he used to consider Nehru to be a bourgeoisie, I think the exact words he used were a bourgeoisie English agent, or something like that. That hasn't changed. We still cannot allow Russia and China ever to come together in any way. And there's the concept of balancing and bandwagoning, which was, you have to essentially, I won't say appease Russia, but buy more arms from Russia, buy more oil from Russia. And if you're going to industrialize, who is the biggest supplier of commodities anywhere in the world? It's Russia. It's a kind of guaranteed supply where you're not going to be blocked off by human rights concerns or whatever that arise every now and then. And this was a point we went on making ad nauseum to the Americans for the last 15 years. You're pushing the Russians too hard. They're going to come together, they're going to come together, they're going to come together. Every time they would say, nah, Putin's a racist. He's white, he believes in white supremacy. It's never going to happen, etc., etc., etc. And guess what? They came together. right? So it turns out for all their big foreign service and foreign policy and all of that, we were right and they were wrong. All their Russia experts. Good for you. The second is military dependence. What we're seeing in Ukraine today is Western weapons. Let me give you a simple example that would make sense to you. How many of you have a German car? Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, whatever. But you don't live in it. You do live in it. No, you don't. Anybody in India who lives in
I
India?
do.
And you have a German car. Good. There at the back. Tell me if this resonates with you. Owning a BMW, Mercedes, Audi in Europe or Australia or America is very, very easy. The mechanic, the technician out there is trained. They have to go back to Austria or Germany or wherever to do these programs. They get paid insane amounts, $80,000 per year or something like that. They know exactly what's wrong, how to fix it. The roads are really nice. If you've driven on the Autobahn or the Autostradale, they're beautiful. You're not going to get big potholes. You're not going to get shards coming through. You're not going to have pollution problems with ingestion and things like that. In India, owning those German cars is an absolute nightmare. You will go every 3 months for servicing. It'll stop. One drop of water, it'll stop. You'll have big potholes where there'll be more water and it'll stop. Maintenance is a nightmare. An Indian automotive technician cannot be trained up to an $80,000 per year salary. Different realities. This is why Western weapons are not completely compatible with an Indian. Weapons are they don't just fit into an ecosystem like that. You can't have isometric mimicry. You can't just take an F-35, fit it into an Indian system and expect it to work as a system of systems that it does in a NATO country, right? Russian weapons that way suit us much better. Because if you've got a MiG-29 standing in front of you, its engines are on, you throw a screwdriver through it, it'll be fine, it'll take off after that, you'll still go fight. Sure, it won't do the same things as an F-35 will, but it'll still do things. It suits our sociological reality much more. We depend on it. The third is the Stalin dictum, which is, quantity has a quality all of its own. And you're seeing that in Ukraine. You're seeing that the Ukrainians can't translate Western weapons because they're so ISR driven, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance driven. They are so technically, in a way, what you're seeing in Ukraine is, I hate to use this example, but exactly what the Wehrmacht faced in Ukraine. Their tanks were so over-engineered. The Germans actually lost twice the number of tanks to their own crews blowing them up than the Russian T-34s blowing them up, right? Over-engineered, unsupplyable, you can't use smart weapons the way you use dumb weapons. These are our realities. There is a sociological reality we have to adjust for, there is a political reality we have to adjust for, and there is a technology reality we have to adjust for. So that balancing that we're going to do between Russia and Europe is not going to go anywhere. And best of luck trying to change it. This is going to be like the American assessments on Russia and China never coming together.
Well said, well said. Alexandros, taking a leaf out of what Abhijeet said, is it you're dispelling trouble, the coming together of Russia and China, and what does that mean for Europe?
Yes, it is one of the challenges that we have obviously on our radar. I want to take you somewhere else. We had a hint of a discussion in the sidelines before. What worries me personally the most is disinformation. Is the fact that it's a new capability. When you can tackle the brains of your own citizens, of the citizens of another country directly at whatever time of day, for me that's the ultimate weapon. The resilience that we need to demonstrate is first and foremost societal resilience. That's why we call it, even in NATO jargon, which is not so much of the jargon, it's the first line of defense, is societal resilience. And we are facing with that challenge, also in Europe, throughout the world, with disinformation coming from Russia. We know it, it's been analyzed, it's there. What is troubling also is that we can see this coming also from China. And we can see it also coming in my own country, for example. And we have to just be aware that messages can be distorted and can affect the societies we live in. And this is, for example, for me, one of the challenges that we don't talk about that much.
Right. Leonid, what are your thoughts on the coming together of China and Russia in context to, what's happening in your country, in Azerbaijan, and of course the entire geopolitical atmosphere there?
That's, I guess, a bit of two separate questions, because coming of Russia together with China, it's of course a global.
Well, China supports Turkey, and Turkey supports Azerbaijan, so obviously there is a link there.
It's not that, I guess, strong. China supporting Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think that China is above this kind of strong ties there. Their ambition, I think, is more global, and they have pretty good relations with Armenia too. They are not strategic or something, but China never been open adversary to Armenia somehow, or trying to support Azerbaijan openly. So we don't see, for example, arms sales from China to Azerbaijan. And in early 90s, for example, there was an arms procurement from China by Armenia in 96. There was such an experience long years ago. Now I think China is very neutral in southern Caucasus, and its main partner is Georgia, by the way. They invest in Georgia mostly, building the logistics there, so I don't see it there too much. How the situation in general affects Armenia with the Russo-Ukrainian war, it's more important because Russia was the security guarantor in the region, and what we have in 2022, we see that Russia was unable to be a real security guarantor in the region. So we had the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, where they had peacekeeping mandate, and we had 2022 September 2-day war, which was also ignored in general by Russia, unfortunately. And on that contrast, it was India who was pretty active in supporting Armenian territorial integrity in September 2022. European Union, United States, and Iran was very strong in supporting Armenian territorial integrity. So here we see the effect of the war more from the Russian side, which I'm not saying that they don't want to, we can't be 100% sure if they don't want to support or fulfill their treaties, but we definitely know that they don't have resources for doing so too. So everything is tied up with the front line, and I think that this effect is also present in can be present in other regions too. So we see that in Syria, for example, we go from Europe to Middle East. They are much less active now militarily on the ground than they were before the 2022, and Iran is more active there. So in general, Russia-China ties, of course, they are now, especially economically, became much stronger, and China and India, by the way, are the biggest oil and gas buyers nowadays, and of course both countries benefit from the situation as the fossils are sold with 20-30% discounts now, so that's a good deal for both countries, and yes, that builds a huge dependency of Russia from China and India in that case. Because I don't think that there are any other alternatives of that volumes in the world available at the moment. So that's the situation. So I guess that this war is very beneficial for Asian giants, let's say, the new emerging powers, in that case, economically. Maybe that sounds cynical, of course, but that's how it works.
Abhijeet, looking at the transatlantic security infrastructure and the internal issues that Europe is plagued with today, migration, Islamic extremism, How do you envisage the next 5-6 years to be for Europe?
Creeping authoritarianism. Creeping authoritarianism, because there are two things with consensuses. There is never anything called a real consensus. The greater the consensus you try to build, the greater there will be geographies of dissent that always emerge. And the more and more, and this is a sociological reality, I'm not, this is what anthropology tells us, that there will be, so right now it's say Viktor Orban, or it's BIS in Poland, and things like that. You will have these greater geographies of dissent that emerge, number one. Number two is, I don't like to call it an Islamist threat to Europe. What it is I don't think Europe grasped the nature of the change from the 1950s Gestarbeit program that Germany started, where Turks were called over to man-heavy industry, which were full-time 9-to-5 jobs more. It was actually quite backbreaking. Modern industry is more service-based. Europe, manufacturing is going down. When you are a service-based industry, getting a huge migration of second world populations, overwhelmingly men, right? Mostly man migration is very different from a selected Gestarbeit migration happening. There has been a severe mismatch. The realities of the 2020s and 2010s aren't the industrial realities of the 1950s and 60s. So there was a huge mismatch out there. I think it is more of an anthropological mismatch than it has anything to do with religion. What is the feature of a second and third world country? A lack of societal control, a lack of governmental monopoly on violence, which means mob violence is much more common. Your ability to act, riots, mobs, whatever, is much higher. You see a replication of that. I don't think it is religious. I don't think it has anything to do with Syrian or Libyans or Arabs. I don't think it has anything to do with Islam. I think it just has to do with anthropological differences. Number one. And I don't think Europe got that. For all the scholarship we hear, we don't get that. My second issue is Europe, like Sir said, has a very valid concern with disinformation. But understand how badly that affects us if we start copying disinformation laws out there, because then it will be used to suppress. Remember, most of you don't go on social media. You are not Saul on the way to Tarsus who's going to have his epiphany. Jesus ain't going to appear and you ain't going to be like, hallelujah, my Lord, I accept thee as my Lord and Savior. That does not happen. You already know where you come from. You go onto social media, and depending on where you lie, you will either follow Free Palestine or I Stand with Israel handles. Social media is about self-validation, alright? You choose to live in your own bubble. So disinformation, in that context, let me ask you something. Every second piece in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and for all their ideological differences between Le Monde and Figaro, Le Monde and Figaro have the exact same editorial line on India, which is the exact same as the Washington Post and New York Times line on India, which is what? That isn't a tea station out there, that's actually a gas chamber. Modi's a fascist and he's going to gas everybody off out there. Is that disinformation? Should I kick out the New York Times correspondent? Should I kick out the Washington Times correspondent? Washington Post correspondent? Should I kick out Le Monde and Le Figaro? And trust me, the Figaro correspondent is really asking to be kicked out. I'd be very happy if he gets kicked out. But great. And he's meant to be the so-called right-wing guy. I've never seen a guy with a worse inferiority complex in need of left-wing validation. It's truly sad, pathetic character. But anyway, now we kick them out. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So these are realities. These are European realities. They don't apply to India. There is no universality of these kind of realities, right? It leads, and we need more expression, we need more dissent, because we're beginning to industrialize, where you need also a stronger state. In a post-industrial state, the state takes a backseat, but industrialization, because of the social churn, requires a much stronger state and a building up of state capacity. The enforcement directorate, everybody tells you the number of raids has increased 6-fold. Well, because you have to assess tax evaders. Therefore, you're building up state capacity. If you build up more police forces, they'll say, well, it's oppression. No, it's better law keeping. So, this, which is why I see a lot more polarization happening out there, and a lot more authoritarianism masked essentially as you're too stupid, you don't know, I know better than you what you need to do.
All right, we've almost reached the end of this conversation, but Alexandros, the concluding thoughts from you on some of the issues related to migration and Islamic extremism in Europe.
Yes, I'm not a particular expert on that issue, but I would like to state something as the same debate that you just mentioned about it being, if used inappropriately as a way to control the masses, absolutely understood. Absolutely. The masses are not stupid. If we call them the masses, it's a very pejorative. Our people are not stupid. Our societies are not stupid. But with the use of a few tweaked pictures, with the placing of information that is used by your adversaries from inside or from within, you can create a lot of harm. We witnessed this in my country very recently, where some other forces created an image in the border with our neighbors Turkey that they were migrants, just to link up to your question, supposed migrants, a supposed little girl that was left to die there by the Greek police forces who didn't intervene, and so on and so forth. You can imagine the stories. I mean, it all took different shapes. It was all fake. It created issues for the government, who appeared as, they didn't do anything about it. It appeared to the outside world as if the Greeks are the biggest racist against a little girl who was, yes, brown, and all that, which is not helpful to what? To the dialogue that we want to institute. I know words are cheap and actions are expensive. What was expensive was the ticket that Abhi paid for to come here. I wanted to thank you and the USANAS Foundation for co-sponsoring my trip here, which is also co-sponsored by the University of Thessaloniki, where is my hometown in Greece, where we do great work on this information, in the good sense of the term, the one that can destabilize. And why? Because this is increasing the dialogue and the rediscovery that we do between our two nations. We had forgotten each other like long-lost cousins. Since many, many millennia, we have had exchanges. We forgot about it, it doesn't matter. We rediscover it now because it is both also in our mutual interest, because we are both growth economies, because we have eventually, very soon, I hope, a direct line connection. We speak about this since yesterday because I love the reference by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. We are rediscovering ourselves because we are neighbors. We are neighbors through Jordan, we are neighbors through the Middle East, we are neighbors through that corridor. That's why we value this long-term project that is very much out there. And these are not just words, this is about connectivity. And we continue with the connectivity that is data, that is energy, that is people, and not only about migration. I don't want to focus always on migration when we can have so much, migration is something negative, when we have so much to gain from each other's exchanges, the knowledge that we have. And I just finished with this. I know AI is the term that is very, very sexy right now. But here, my Prime Minister, I loved it, and I'm just going to repeat it. We call it ancestral intelligence between our two.
All right, we've completely run out of time. Leonid, if you can just finish your point in 10 seconds, then we'll wrap up.
In 10 seconds, I only can thank everybody for the panel.
Why don't you do that?
Hope that our countries represented here will find their right place in the new world order, on the forming world order, and hopefully Greece, Armenia and India will have even deeper relations, both in multifacets, so economic, security, tourism, and I want to join with the idea of direct flight lines. Once again, we want the same very much, and we want to be a bigger part of India's extended neighborhood, as it was mentioned yesterday.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of this wonderful panel. Big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much.